computer. You'll see a little window, just say got it. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Barb Atwell. I am with the Berkeley Society of Friends. I am part of the Racial Justice Action Team. This event is the discussion of learning in public, written by Courtney Martin. And we also have Ingrid Hogle, who will be here talking about the book. We are sponsored by the Social and Environmental Action Committee, as well as the Outreach and Nurture Committee. So it's October 15th, 2021, and I'm so very glad to see you all. What I'd like to do now is read Courtney's bio. She is a writer living with her family in a co-housing community in Oakland. The Temescal neighborhood is one of my favorites. She has a popular Substack newsletter, Examined Families, and she speaks widely at conferences and colleges throughout the country. She is also the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, the Fresh Speakers Bureau, and the Bay Area chapter of Integrated Schools. Her happy place is asking people questions. This is her 4th book. I have to give a personal story, Courtney. The first time I knew who you were is when Ingrid sent me an email about the Barn Raisers Project. And because of your email, I took that 10-week series, but I just loved your smart and sassy style. And so I'm really happy to finally meet you.
Thank you so much, Barb. This is such an honor to be here. I'm just throwing Barn Raisers in the chat in case anyone is interested in checking it out. It's run by our mutual friend now, Barb. I hope you would call Garrett a friend, Garrett Bucks, who's based in Milwaukee. And he just does the most beautiful, brilliant job of thinking about how to call in white folks to this anti-racist work and how to really take action in a way that I admire so much. I feel like he's had some Quaker influence, but I can't remember. Barb, has Garrett had Quaker days? I can't remember.
I believe he has, but I can't remember the direct connection.
Yeah, but you'll feel it if you do Garrett's training. I think you'll feel that in him. So anyway, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm so grateful, and I have often joked that Quakers are like my favorite people because I didn't have the benefit of growing up in a Quaker church, but I've been mentored deeply by Parker Palmer, whose writing I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and my kindergartner, who's at Emerson now, is Stella Parker. She's named after Parker. So they're buds and have a very sweet relationship. So anyway, I feel very grateful to be here and to be among people who know a lot about asking questions and sitting with silences and the complexity of social change and all these kind of questions. So thank you for having me.
So did you want to give a little bit of an intro about the book and about why you wrote it?
Yeah. First of all, how many of you have read the book? If you have, put your hand up so it won't be repetitive. Okay, so probably about half. Well, forgive me, those of you who have read it, if this feels a bit repetitive, but I sort of describe the origins story of writing the book as being about when my first daughter, Maya, was born. She's about to turn 8 in November. And we had just moved to Oakland, moved into this co-housing community, and she was born. And I really was kind of catching up to myself, like trying to make sense of my life now that I had a brand new baby. I don't know how many folks on the call remember that feeling of just kind of like, who am I? What is this new role? What is this new life? So I would sort of ground myself by walking. I just walked endlessly in the neighborhood with Maya in the little baby Bjorn ergo thing on me. And I would listen to podcasts and I would just sort of try to like get back into my body. And I often passed what, Ingrid and I now know so well was Emerson Elementary School. But at the time had no idea what it was, just knew it seemed to be our local elementary school. And I started to kind of notice the kids and stop and admire them. They were so joyful and so full of life, so free, especially at recess. Watching kids at recess is kind of like the best thing in the whole world. And yet I also noticed so few of them were white, which seemed weird to me because I'd noticed the complexion of most of the folks in our neighborhood, and it was pretty multiracial. There were Black multi-generational families, there were white families, there were a lot of Asian American families. So I asked myself, where are all the white kids? And as I say in the book, that was kind of the question that launched 1,000 moral miles for me, of trying to understand, where do white kids in this neighborhood go? Why don't they go to this school? And then trying to figure that out and make a decision for myself. And I'm trained as a journalist, so I both, was trying to understand that from the perspective of a mother, and a white mother, importantly, but also the perspective of a journalist. I started to read everything and listen to a million podcasts and study the history of the failed history of integration in this country. And so that's what led to this book.
Great. Great. And then Ingrid, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So most of you, no, I don't know if most of you know me. Some of you know me. I became a Quaker in Davis when I was in grad school, and I had always admired the Quakers, and I went to a Quaker meeting and fell in love with it immediately. And then when I got my current job here in 2006, I transferred my membership to Berkeley Friends Meeting. And once my boy, who's now 9.5, was born, I really started coming less and less to meeting for worship, and I miss it, but it's just what happened. So, but I'm still, I still do participate sometimes, and I became really active in the Friends Committee on National Legislation with Jeannie Stowers and Marilyn Cleveland here, who are continuing to run the group. I had to step away from that really recently, but anyway, that's who I am. And I guess I joined that because I was terrified for my kid to grow up in a world where there's so much war and threat of nuclear war and that kind of thing. And I'm really drawn to anti-racism work because I'm terrified for my son to grow up in a world where, people get murdered because of their skin color. It's just so messed up.
Mm-hmm. And I also just want to mention that last year when I got to go to the Friends Committee on National Legislation, I was so excited to work with you because I'd never done lobbying, and you were just such a stellar example of what needed to be done. And I really appreciate your confidence and your willingness to be direct and honest. It's really great. So thanks for being here.
And I can pile on, because I've seen that version of Ingrid in the school setting where, I'm timidly trying to figure out how to do things, and Ingrid's like jumping in and talking to all the parents and recruiting people for PTA meetings, and just had a tremendous amount of energy that I always have, deeply extroverted energy, and just like, if this is how we got to get it done, we're going to get it done. She works the problem in this way that I deeply admire. And so when Barb asked about this, I was like, we got to do it with Ingrid, because she's got the inside track and actually has mentored me in many ways, because she's ahead of me with her kid being older at Emerson.
Wonderful. So I was thinking that we could move over to doing some of the book readings, and you and I have talked about it. And Courtney, you don't mind starting with page 198?
Not at all.
Maybe
Yeah,
you can set the stage. I'm not sure exactly the best.
Set people up a little bit. I remember there was a directive on 198, starting with when people of Caucasian descent. Okay.
And you can set up any kind of background,
So, Ingrid and our kids go to a school that is majority Black, about 75% kids, give or take, are on free and reduced lunch.
I'll close the door in.
Families are experiencing
Louis, you want to come in?
Hang on just a second. Hang on. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Okay, please go ahead.
So majority Black, majority families experiencing poverty. We have about a quarter newcomers. So those are families who've immigrated recently and their kids may speak English as a second language. We also have lots of, and largely that population is kind of either Latinx or a lot of kids from the Middle East, Ethiopia, Eritrea, all of which I know both Ingrid and I consider like such a blessing and a richness of our school is we have, you know, families from all over the world. So that's kind of the setting we're in, especially when Ingrid first enrolled her kid. I think probably there were 8% white kids or something like that. Now that number has creeped up a bit. And so, you know, a lot of the book is about figuring out how to show up humbly and with joy and figure out how to, you know, offer our resources as people who've come from backgrounds that have been more economically privileged and, you know, free of some of the structural racism impacts that so many of our families experience. But also not, you know, coming in with a big agenda about what we think needs to change about the school, but really listening and trying to kind of collaborate and figure it out. So my older daughter qualified for what's called transition kindergarten. If your kid's born in the fall in Oakland, you get to send them to this kind of pre-kindergarten year. And so we had a woman named Mrs. Miner as a teacher, a Black woman born and raised in Oakland, multi-generational Oakland family. And she's just a tremendous educator. Just like the second you see her in a classroom, you're like, this woman knows what she's doing. She's building a world all her own, like just so talented. And she and I had a good relationship, but I also felt like it was somehow guarded. Like I would ask her about certain things and I couldn't quite tell what she thought. So this scene is, she's just quit working at Emerson and she is opening up her own preschool in East Oakland, which probably most of you know is one of the poorest neighborhoods in Oakland. And I asked her, can I come and interview her? And she says, sure, you can come during kind of the lunch nap time moment when all the babies are sleeping and we'll sit in the kitchen and talk. And I said, I'm writing this book about integration. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. So this is just a little bit of us chatting about that. Let's see. I think I'm actually going to start a tiny bit earlier. So she stretches the word gentrification out like she's teaching it to me. It's like, oh, that's what's happened to my neighborhood. Yeah. And all of a sudden, these old warehouses that were just nothing for years as I grew up are now housing Cal Berkeley students. And now the park that I grew up going to, they used to call it Pepsi Cola Park, is a charter school. So it definitely just tells you flat out, when people of Caucasian descent move in, things change. And you could say for the better, but what's for the better? I can feel my brain and heart short circuit the way they often do when gentrification comes up, particularly if a person of color is saying it. Like a lot of progressives, if I'm making an argument with someone I consider white and clueless, I sometimes catch myself wielding the word like a weapon against unfeeling economic elitism. But when I'm the one being implicated, I feel it shut me down, and a swell of guilt and helplessness rises up. Systemic complexity and my own complicity in it are overwhelming. It is no coincidence that my family and I showed up just as soon as $6 oat milk lattes became available within walking distance. So many Black families at Emerson have been displaced, yet they continue to loyally drive their kids or grandkids back to the old neighborhood to attend school, which is no longer the old neighborhood, because of me. As Eve L. Ewing, author of Ghosts in the Schoolyard, so beautifully puts it, the troubling history of racism in housing and schooling as paired institutions in the community, at once parallel and circling one another, like the strands of a double helix. There might be some net good created by sending my kid to the local school rather than strategizing my way into the white, better performing one. But the fact that I can walk there and maybe even want a cookie for my courage is a really impoverished way of understanding my impact on the community where I live. Things are just unfair in so many ways, says Mrs. Miner, the energy in her voice cranking up. It's education, it's the neighborhood. Historically, that's how it's been. Now the question is, how can we make things more equal? I'll stop there for that one. So I go back over and over and talk to Mrs. Miner, and in fact, we continue to have a really special and complicated in the best sense of that word relationship. So I can talk to you guys more about her if you're interested. And then I was also going to read on page 262 through the end of the chapter. This is another conversation with her. The air is lighter between us today, and our conversation flows fast, punctuated by knowing laughter. I describe the meeting that I went to in the church basement and the confusion I felt in the days after. Mrs. Miner nods her head thoughtfully. She does all kinds of things in her preschool designed to seed her students' literacy, talking through the names and sounds of all the letters daily, practicing drawing those letters on whiteboards, surrounding them with books almost exclusively featuring Black characters. But she also recognizes that it's not just the mechanics that matter. I feel like even the foundations of reading should be about, do you know there was a point when we weren't allowed to read? Do you know that they were afraid of how amazing and capable your ancestors were, so they didn't let them read? Your ancestors had to sneak to learn to read. They were killed for doing these things. If we don't teach Black kids reading with this deeper context, then it's like a subconscious burden inside of them. They can't put their finger on it. It's the conversation that's never really addressed. It's a deeper knowing inside every person of color. And at some point, you kind of wake up to it, even if no one wants to discuss it. How did you wake up to it? I ask. She purses her lips, thinking for a moment or two, and then says, from a very young age, I had a sense of how unjust things were. It was just kind of inside of me. But I think it really started to come together when I was a teenager. I was inspired by Tupac Shakur, not all the music, but he had several songs and poetry that were definitely about our plight as a people. And his mom was a Black Panther. And I knew a lot of kids in the neighborhood whose parents were actually in the Black Panther Party. All of a sudden I was like, wait, I was taught a lie all my life? I mean, when I learned about the Catholic Inquisition, and I was like, wait a minute, Grandma, why are we Catholic? They went around killing people. We both laugh a bit at the thought of a teenaged Artemis confronting her formidable grandmother with her newfound knowledge. That's why I teach for truth, Mrs. Miner says, the pride palpable in her voice. Teaching can be a very radical thing, or it can be basically brainwashing everyone into the same false story. I flash back to the Black History Month poem she shouted into the mic. With knowledge of self, we have pride, but education is the key. And when we raise educated, proud children, they are free. You did such an amazing job of teaching all the kids in Maya's class the facts about slavery and the civil rights movement, the sit-ins and the bus boycott, I say. But I worry about the meaning white kids make of all that. Do they think racism happens in dramatic moments? How do we as white parents teach them that it's also systemic and ongoing? How do we show them not just the potential for white harm, but examples of white people being anti-racist? She's nodding, her lips pursed like she's really thinking through what I'm saying, trying to discern her truth in relationship to it. I'm just not sure we can teach white kids about systemic racism if we opt out of the system. That's me talking. As I'm saying it, I glance over at Mrs. Miner's daughter, curled up on the futon around a sheet of paper coloring. And I'm remembering your homeschooling. So maybe you're like, she fills in the blank before I can. The system sucks. We both laugh. I hear you, I say, but theoretically, public education is supposed to be there for everybody, like a public good. And I want to be forced for making that public good something better for everybody. She nods and then says, I get that, but it's also frustrating because it's almost like nothing gets done until all of a sudden the white people make a fuss about it. The system doesn't care unless you show up and say things are broken. Sometimes it feels like Black people don't even care enough. It's like we wait for the great white hope to come and join the march. Now we care? I can tell Black people all day, this is where we come from. This is who we are. This is our culture. But when a white person says it, oh, you all deserve better. Well, now that's true. That hits me like a punch in the gut. It might be useful ultimately for my white kid and my white resources to be at Emerson, but why does it take that? While I find Mrs. Miner's cynicism about the system deflating, I understand it, and I also see how it's a direct path from that kind of cynicism to the most optimistic act of all, world building. Like the Black Panthers who didn't try to reform white America, but rejected it entirely, she has left behind the trappings of white-defined success, a steady, albeit underpaid job, to create an oasis for Black children worthy of their inherent beauty and latent potential. Now I'm just gonna read a little bit from the conclusion. White people,
Excuse
yeah.
me for interrupting. I just wondered if you could go really slowly so that I can hear it
Yes.
all. I want to make sure I get it. Thank you.
You got it. White people in America are raised to believe that we are the authors of our own lives. We are born into a family, sure, but really we are born into an ethos, that we live in a place where we can spend a lifetime figuring out who we are, what we love, and then pursue a life around those loves. That we are entitled to this kind of authorship, this kind of control and safety. And that ours is an innocent, solitary pursuit. That our job and our house and our kids and our dream have nothing to do with anyone else's. We've conjured them up from the thin air of the ethos. Our blood, sweat, and tears, though really there's not much blood. Our beginning, our middle, eventually our end. But when you start to look closely at race in America and you are white and well-meaning, you often have this sense of the story coming apart. Part of it is a loss of innocence, a reckoning with your authorship. You realize that all along, you've not been writing the story. You've been choosing your own adventure in a pre-written, fairly unimaginative young adult fiction series where no one ever really grows up. I didn't ask to be born into a white family in Colorado Springs on the last hour of the last day of the 1970s. I didn't ask to be made of sensitive stuff, filled with colorblind ideology by ex-hippie parents and teachers, and then pickled in Biggie Smalls and a study abroad program in South Africa and September 11th. Maya, that's my daughter's name, didn't ask to be born to a white mom in Oakland who can't keep her damn hands off a keyboard. It's disorienting and sometimes off-putting to be asked to place yourself within a larger national history, some of which you hardly have the stomach to even look at in still, grainy black and white photographs, much less 8 minutes and 46-second videos. But Indigenous folks have the premium on didn't sign up for this. Black Americans definitely have a profound claim on didn't sign up for this. For many of them, it started on a slave ship in 1619. It led to a colony in 1719, a cotton plantation in 1819, a Chicago beach in 1919, see the Red Summer, a city street anywhere in America in 2019. Imagine how much a single mom contending with homelessness, sitting in a government office for 4 hours only to be disrespected by the underpaid bureaucrat feels, I didn't sign up for this. Or the flood of immigrants showing up at our southern border out of economic desperation or fleeing violence. Did they sign up for camping out, unwanted and unwelcomed in the desert? Did they sign up for living in a land whose terrain and words are unintelligible, whose people may be openly hostile, where money is easier to come by perhaps, but still never enough? Part of the mental journey of white America is a painful realization that we are not the benevolent center of the universe, even if we are good and watch the right documentaries and gave the right end-of-year gifts. We are part of systems, economic, educational, medical, that were designed by unabashed racist patriarchs who prioritize profit above all else. These systems have been tweaked over the years to appear less racist, less sexist, and sometimes less capitalistic, and some of these tweaks have altered individual lives. Despite the performance of reform, these systems have remained largely intact from our founding, causing profound harm to people of color and limiting the white American imagination. So white people do what white people have done for generations. We are kind, or so we think, to individual people of color. This is where we feel we have control. While participating in the systems that disenfranchise, exploit, and sometimes even kill them. And this is where we pretend we have no control. So what do you do when you wake up in the middle of your life and realize you've been dropped down in the middle of a story, in the middle of unjust systems, in the middle of a country's profound reckoning? Stop looking away. We live in very broken times, times with lots of gaps between the difficult reality of life and what we know to be possible humanly, says Quaker author Parker Palmer. One of the most important qualities a person can have in our time, a person who wants to make this a better world, is the capacity to stand in the tragic gap between corrosive cynicism and irrelevant idealism, between what is and could be. The gift of the gap is that it's honest. There is liberation in letting go of the delusion that your choice doesn't matter in the face of such vast tragedy. A liberation in understanding you are not the center of the universe, but neither are your actions insignificant. As my late friend Courtney said, you're either contributing to school segregation and concentrations of whiteness and privilege, or you're making a choice to not have that as a priority. Integration isn't the answer, but it's a wildly worthy quest, personally and politically, in these beautiful broken times. It's a way to practice being brave, to collectively build a nation as we wish it were. It's a way of finally growing up. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a good way to wrap that section up. What is and what could be. Thank you. You know, I really appreciate your writing style. I find it so direct and honest, and you've got the humor there. You've got the provocation, like we just heard, which I love, and obviously your tenderness for your children. And you know, there's a theme about throughout the whole thing about how awkward you felt in the situations, you know, with Mrs. Minor and various other people. And I'd like to know, you know, you've talked about how you overcame some of that awkwardness to establish relationships and move through and make decisions. But can you tell me what you have learned since writing the book?
So much, so much since writing the book. I've learned, I just keep learning, as I'm sure the crew on this call keeps learning all the time. And I wanted to say, I read that section because one of my biggest learnings is that this is a generational story, and that really every generation is trying to move it forward just that much more. And so for me, it felt really important to think about my parents and think about my grandparents and think about like how each generation on some level does the best they can with the information they have. But the crux is, what information do you actually have? And are you willing to face up to it and be honest about what you know? And so like in Ingrid, in my case, our generation of parents knows, because there's a lot of research on it, that integration works, that there are all of these, you know, efforts to close the gap on educational inequity. And what we know from, there's a Berkeley professor named Rucker C. Johnson who's done the best research on this, that the earlier and the longer that Black and brown kids are in integrated schools, the better their educational outcomes. They graduate more, they do better on tests, they go to college more, they stay in college more, but also they even live longer. Like even non-academic measurements are better for them. They earn more over a lifetime. And that white kids who go to integrated schools do fine on all of those measures and also have an additional social emotional capacity because they've been in school with kids from all different backgrounds their whole lives. So that's not just my opinion, that is like big, important longitudinal research. So for me, that was like, for Ingrid and my generation of parents, like we have that information. We know that to be true. So what are we going to do about it? Right? I think my parents didn't have that information. They didn't really know that integration could be such a profound equalizer. There was a lot of talk about it, but there hadn't been much studies about it. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. What have I learned? I've learned, you know, there's been, you know, a beautiful outpouring of positivity about the book and the way it's shifted how people think about parenting and education, all kinds of things. There's also been some criticism. And one of the critiques has been about that people who are biracial or multiracial feel like they can't find themselves in the book. And so and there are plenty of multiracial or biracial people who do find themselves in the book. So it's not a monolithic experience, but I've been thinking about that a lot, and how my own thinking can get pretty binary, kind of black and white when I think about race. And that I struggle as a white author sometimes with how to kind of hold all of it, particularly when there are multiracial people in the book who identify as Black, as an example. But then when a multiracial person says, I didn't see myself, but it's hard because I'm thinking, well, you are just like this other person actually by racial background, but that person identifies as Black and you identify as biracial. So I'm always going to use the identity that the person says they want to be identified by, but it just kind of brings up for me the complexity of this multiracial America we're all living in, where it's obviously not black and white by any means, but then kind of how do you hold all of that complexity? And mostly I'm resigned to that I did the best I could, and there's only so much complexity one can hold, but I do think about, where could I have done that differently? And as I, actually live this journey, how can I be sure I'm not falling into black and white thinking around race, but really holding this, just the multitude of identities that are coming to this conversation. I did read a book called Minor Feelings since I wrote the book, which I think I quote once in the book, but it's about Asian American identity in America, and it's had a really profound effect on me, and just kind of opened my eyes to how totally inadequate the term Asian American is, and that language matters, right? Like we have that language, and then our minds, particularly if it's not like we don't have a connection via our own identity to that category, can kind of reduce things. And so I think I'm really thinking a lot about just like the complexity and beauty and variety of Asian American identity that I've somewhat been exposed to through literature or through friendships, but I think I just haven't spent as much time thinking about Asian American identity as I have Black America. I was a big hip hop fan growing up. And so like for me, Black and Latinx influence was always present through like the culture and the music and the movies that I watched and the poetry that I read. So good thing you have a lifetime to learn about all the beautiful parts of this country. But yeah, I think that's been a learning. What else? I don't know. I guess I'll stop there and let have other questions. I'm always learning, so I could go on and on about learning.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to let others ask questions in just a minute, but I wanted to switch over to Ingrid. So Ingrid, I know that your son is in Emerson, and I just know from the book some of the experiences you had, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that experience has been for you, and if it's different than what is in the book.
Okay. Well, I don't think you read this page on page 261 to 262. I have my notes that I took during the book. But Courtney had been talking about sending some resources by text to Miss Minor. And I think her friend Dina might have called her out on that and been like, why do you feel that's necessary? And I was like, oh boy, I resemble that. But as Courtney knows, I send resources to her all the time. And I don't know. I don't think that she's like, what does she think? I'm stupid. We share podcasts that we found interesting with each other and so on. So hopefully Miss Minor took it that way, and people who I send resources to take it that way, that, my mom's on this call. It's like when your mom sends you, a newspaper clipping because she wants you to see something. Like, it's because she loves you, you know? So that part resembled me for sure. And also just like the texts back and forth with folks that grew up in a different culture, even if they grew up speaking English, like the expressions, the spelling or lack thereof on the text messages and so on, like some of it's just totally over my head. I'm like, I have no idea what that person's trying to get through to me. And sometimes I'll just send a question mark, like, what, you know? So that also really resonated with me in the book. Yeah. And then you said what's different?
So if you could just talk a little bit about the experience that you have had having your son in Emerson, and if he's talked to you about it, and any kind of feedback you've gotten.
Okay, well, when we were looking at schools, we put Chabot, we're trying to figure out like, well, Chabot has more spaces than Peralta, but Peralta's quicker to get to walking. So, which one do we put first? And agonized over like, so I think we put Peralta first and Chabot second. And then apparently we put Kaiser third, which I find hard to believe, but the school assignment office tells me I did. That's where all our neighbors who are white sent their kids. And then, so my kid isn't friends with any of the neighbor kids because he doesn't go to school with them. It's kind of sad. And then we put Emerson because Emerson, we had toured it and it was quicker. It was easy to get to by bicycle. And Kaiser is not. Kaiser is uphill. There's no, even if you have an electric bike, there's no safe way to get your kid up there except by driving. And just as a ecologist, I just couldn't do it. So we ended up being assigned to Emerson. And then first day of school, I took him there. And I don't know, probably some of you cried on the first day of school when your baby went off to school. I sure did. And then I saw the kids like walking out of their classroom and getting taught how to walk in a line, and they're walking single file with their hands behind their back, holding their own hands behind their back, single file. And I just lost it. And I was like, I've heard of the school to prison pipeline, but I didn't know it started in kindergarten. Like they're teaching them how to, so that was, the optics were bad. I didn't do well with the optics. And so I'd say like at first daily, I was like, all right, we're just going to see how it goes this week, and then it became weekly. At this point, I'd say it's like maybe every 3 months, maybe. I'm like, well, if things get really bad, we can put them in private school. But that's me. Like, that's me being like a neurotic, anxious person. I'm in therapy, don't worry. But, it's like, I always need an escape route. I always have my escape route plan. My mom will let you know this is true. So that's been my experience. And, Courtney described it that I dug in and that I was omnipresent in the school, and it's true. And that definitely helped, because when you start to get to know people for real and you see more than just the fact that teacher and most of the teachers make them walk single file with their hands behind their back, but you get to know the teachers and you see how much love they're giving to the kids, and then you realize that no, they just don't want the kids to hit each other. Like, it's okay. I was able to relax a little.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
I really appreciate it. Linda, you should be so proud. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can look at everyone on board here. And if you want to wave at me, I'll just call on you and then you can unmute. And I know dear Helen is ready to talk. So Helen, if you want to unmute, please go ahead.
Yeah, before we get away from it too far, I want to talk about the multiracial part that you brought up, because it's so important. And I think you've got another book there if you want to go there, or two. And I've talked to multiracial people and they have the same problem. They see things in terms of black and white, and they see themselves, am I black or am I white? So that's not all about you. You know, I'm not saying it's not us, but it's very confusing for a child sometimes. And sometimes they don't think about it if they're family, but sometimes they do. You know, am I like my mom or am I like my dad or whatever, you know, what is going on? Anyway, and I think the whole Asian thing is still another thing. I have a friend who's Korean American and went on 21andMe. I think that's what it's called.
23.
Thank you. The ancestry.com
Mm-hmm.
thing. And found out that she had a small part of Japanese in her. And she said, oh, my mother would be horrified. I can't ever tell her that. You know, it didn't bother her, but her, you know, her mother still lives in Korea and is in a different life. And it's, you've got I guess what I'm trying to say is you've got the multi-generation problem there too. So that's another whole aspect of it. As I say, you've got another book or two if you want to get
Sure.
But I do think that if you start talking to people, they have just as much or more, probably a lot more problem than we do with that.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you're surfacing, which is I think, and I really confront this in myself and tried to confront this in the book, that we can be such binary thinkers, right? Like we think black versus white, good versus bad. This choice to integrate is, you know, me and Ingrid are like the white saviors of Oakland, or we are, you know, annoying, misguided, whatever. It's like, no, it's all in between, right? It's like, I'm neither a good person or a bad person. I'm like everybody else. I have parts of all of that in me. This choice is neither saving anyone, nor is it a terrible idea. It's like something in between and depends on our experiences and how we show up. And because I think a lot of white people who care about anti-racism want certainty. They want to hear like, these are the things that I can do that are definitely the right things to do, that other people will see them as the right things to do, etc. Because we live in a challenging culture right now of when you try to do the right thing, sometimes people think it's performative or misguided, or, you know, so it can actually discourage people from taking actions like this. Certainly from writing this book, it felt very vulnerable to put this book in the world in this particular climate.
I bet.
And so I really look, there are women in my life in particular, older women who are not binary thinkers. My mom is one of them, who are just really like, see the spectrums. And I think that's my version of wisdom, is how do I keep trying to live into that in the way I see things, while still, you know, putting a line in the sand. Like I want to be bold. Tori has this cool comment in the chat about her own experience. And I think, you know, I want to be bold and say, I'd like more white people to right size their risk. Like, I really do think white parents could make different choices, and not all of them. I know everyone has their own story about like what they need to do. But so it's that, how do I hold the complexity and the spectrum and kind of non-binary thinking, but also be bold and like really challenge my peers, and not let people off the hook when they have a million justifications for why this is too scary.
Thank you for that. Who's next? Sarah, please.
Hi, Courtney. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for the book. I have only gotten about a third of the way through it, but I really have been enjoying it. So I am I'm here through the Berkeley meeting. I'm a member of the Berkeley meeting, and I'm a bit older. So I don't have school age kids. I haven't for some time. Um, and I do remember um, when I was kind of step parenting a couple of young ones. I am 30 years ago now. Yeah, about 30 years ago. This house in San Lorenzo was the first home purchase, and we picked it out partly because, it's a good school district, a good school, not district because there's not really one in San Lorenzo, but the good local elementary school. And I think at that time, I mean, this community in San Lorenzo was actually a community where there were actually uh, the homeowners association actually had a thing about not selling or renting to people of color. Now that has changed. My neighbors next door here are African American, or I think there's some sort of Latinx neighbors on the other side across the street. There's Asian people, so that's been changing. But initially that was that. So this all makes me kind of a little sad to think that back then I was kind of bought into that. Um, I had a couple other questions. I was wondering about your co-housing community and to what extent that is integrated. I think you've mentioned a couple of Asian uh, people as your neighbors, but I don't know if you've mentioned many that I've seen so far in the book. Mentioned many people who are African American or Black, whatever. So
Yeah, so I live in a place called Temescal Commons. It's on 42nd, right above Telegraph, if folks are familiar with the neighborhood. And it is not, it's 21 years old. It was founded originally out of a Christian church community, and then it has evolved to be interfaith. So now we have people of all kind of faith backgrounds, or not all, but many faith backgrounds. And it is Asian American, Latinx, and white. We don't have any Black residents right now. And primarily owners. There's a few renters. We're very intergenerational. So our eldest member is an 83-year-old single woman who maybe even if there are activists in the call, you can't miss Louise Dunlap. She's like a major East Bay activist. I don't know if anyone's ever been on like a peace march with her or something, but she's like just an incredible woman and a real mentor to me on anti-racism too. She's been evolving her thinking for 80 years now in a way that I admire so much. So she lives in an apartment, like a studio apartment, and then we have, a home with 4 kids in it. So, like there's a big range of family size and structure.
okay. And
Uh,
there's a mix of housing sizes too, it sounds like.
yeah,
There's some apartments and some larger single family homes. So that's
yeah,
pretty cool.
exactly. And actually, when they founded it, they did build one unit with a small unit with 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, hoping that they could house 2 single moms. Like that was kind of their dream. And it didn't really manifest. I don't totally understand why. I think it had something to do with housing, prices, and it was one of those great ideas that never came to fruition, which we all know a lot about, I'm sure. But so it's had a range of people in the community over the years, and a range of economic status. Like one of our renters is a window washer for a living, and then we have architects and accountants and more sort of like what we think of as kind of professional class folks, a lot of teachers, nurses. So because it was founded 21 years ago, it is kind of a different era in terms of the housing prices in Oakland. So that's been a really incredible community. And I think for me, because I actually didn't know almost anyone who was making the same choice I was, my co-housing community was a profound influence on me, because they have this ethos of radical hospitality and just like showing up and keep showing up, and like everyone is worthy, and this sort of just beautiful teaching to me of how to be in community. And so I think it really did help me make this choice, even on kind of a subconscious level.
Okay, then the other thing I just wanted to note, and I don't know if maybe it's appropriate to bring this up or not, but as a meeting, we've heard, I don't know, kind of sort of the other side of the story, I guess maybe, which was another presentation from another author of a book. What is it called? It was the one woman who was a friend of Linda Self's, and it was a book about her experiences teaching in the East Oakland school system, a little bit older kids. And there were some really, really hard stories in there. And some of those kids do have really, really hard lives. And so, yeah, Bronwyn Harris is the name of the author. Thanks, Barb. Um, I, I got the book here somewhere, but I don't know where. But so that, I mean, you know, I mean, there are certainly schools like Emerson, and I'm really, really glad to hear about them. And I think it sounds just like really great. But I think there are also schools where, you know, legitimately um, aren't as good an environment for kids. And I don't know how we should kind of balance that out. That's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to ask about, we as Quakers, we have this organization called the Friends Council on Education, and there's lots of Quaker private schools. So there's kind of and I think, well, there's not a consensus, but there's kind of a push towards private Quaker education. But then there's also some Quakers who say that's not the direction to go. We should put our resources into the kinds of things you're talking about, which is improving public education for everyone. And I don't know if you had any comments on that. And I'll be quiet now. Let other people ask.
Well, I wanted to say, I haven't read the book that you're referencing, but just to be clear, and you're not into this part of the book yet, but we have a lot of kids and families at Emerson who are really struggling. I mean, really like drug addiction, mental health struggles, and, you know, kids who are unhoused, you know, so the beauty that I'm describing is not to the absence of that. It's actually like that there's this beautiful community that also continues to try to serve and maybe fails in some ways, but succeeds in some ways, those kids and those families. And I really, in the book, try to encourage us to stop thinking about good and bad schools. I do think there are schools that fail their kids in many ways, some of them even structural, like asbestos in the walls and unclean water and stuff that's just like so incredibly basic. But I think that most schools really make an effort to serve their kids, and that the kind of perception of them as bad schools is this self-fulfilling prophecy where they get less families with resources, so that they have less funding, so they have high turnover with teachers and principals, and it just kind of like builds on itself. Whereas if we, you know, could talk about all schools in terms of strengths and challenges and try to integrate them so that there was more economic diversity in all schools, that would be really helpful. The other thing you should know is that the most segregated schools in America are white schools, right? If you look statistically at where the most homogeneous schools are, it's these very white concentrations that are in some schools. And I would argue that that is also toxic, that there's something toxic about poverty and the effects it has on kids, but there's also something very toxic about excess and the effects it has on kids. And so I just introduced that to you. Now I'm forgetting the other question, your last question.
What was it? About public versus private
Oh, yes.
education.
I'm so inspired by the Quakers who say, let's do the public thing. I think that's a beautiful, like, application of Quaker values. Ingrid's the one who taught me about that. And I was like, wow, that is so cool. Because I'd heard of Quaker schools, and I think I've even spoken at Quaker schools with other books of mine. And I thought they were just so beautiful, and like I loved the values. And I remember thinking like, oh, if I ever have kids, like I would want them to go to a place like this. So I get all the attractions, and I'm very compelled by them. But I thought that was so moving when Ingrid told me about that other philosophy of that it's perhaps even more Quaker to like be a part of the public system.
Thank you. I wanted to mention that there's some really great information in the chat, and I will save the chat and I will share that with you. I just need for you to put your email address in the chat so I know how to send this to you. But we have plenty of time to ask more questions. And let's,
So for everybody, Barb,
I'm sorry,
everybody should put their email in there.
anybody that wants the chat.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And Marion, you first.
Barb, I wanted to ask both Courtney and Ingrid, how will you choose the next school? Because they don't get to stay in elementary school forever.
No, don't say it ain't so, Marion. I think Ingrid and I are both obsessed with our children, and we wouldn't mind having them stay. So yeah. Ingrid, I'll let you start because you're closer to it than I am.
Well, when Anders was in preschool, he told me he was going to go to that preschool through high school. So I think we might just go back to the preschool. They had a really great play structure in the backyard and awesome finger paints. And I mean, it was the best. Yeah, no, I struggle with that. Our dear librarian, who Courtney and I and my mom are all big fans of, introduced me to a white lady during a Ride for a Reason fundraisers. Ingrid, you have to meet this friend of mine. And she said she sent her kids to Claremont Middle School a long time ago. And she's so happy because Claremont Middle School just got like, I don't remember what, it's like a presidential award or something. And she's like, it wasn't like that when she started. And so it's like, okay. So I went over and met this lady and she's like, my daughter was the only girl there. Now, what word did she leave out? She left out the word white. My daughter was the only girl there. And my son was only one of a couple of boys there when we started. But we made that school better. And I was just like, where's my puke bag, right? Like, are you kidding me? So, so that school is now a really good school, and it's our zone school. So hooray. Yeah, I mean, what do you do with that? You know, Courtney and I have a friend, Rachel Latta, who what she decided to do with that was pull her kid out of their super white privileged white school and cart them across town to a really under-resourced Black majority school. Am I going to do that? I don't know. I've already told you I want to ride my bike to wherever we go. So probably not. But I have an escape plan. I told you about that earlier. And my escape plan is Sweden. And one of the things that Courtney mentioned, and Courtney, I've been meaning to, we didn't get to have coffee because I've been sick for a month, but one of the things I've been meaning to tell Courtney is she mentions referencing ancestors. You guys actually heard her talk about that. That was something that Mrs. Miner said. Well, that's my ancestry on my mom's side. And I've lived there, I've learned the language, and I want my son to get that experience. And middle school stinks. And I've heard it's a little bit kinder and gentler over there. So if we can deal with the COVID policies they've been taking on a couple of years from now, maybe we'll go there for a year.
That's awesome. I would be sad to lose you to Sweden, but I think that would be such an amazing experience. Yeah, I'm kind of one foot in front of the other. Like, I'm like, Marion, who am I going to be on Sunday? I don't know. So I haven't thought about middle school. I have a second grader and a kindergartner, so I'm really far away from it. And to this point, some people ask me why I wrote the book when I did, like, why didn't I wait until I had lived more of elementary school? And it's because I've written a few books and I write a lot of shorter form essay work. And I find that when I get too far away from something, and I haven't, particularly if I haven't taken really good notes, I lose the visceral emotional immediacy of it. And I really felt, even from the shift from the moment that I was trying to make the decision till a couple years later, I was like, I hardly remember what that anxiety felt like. It's like I've lived so deeply into being okay at Emerson and seeing my kids okay at Emerson that it's hard for me to even imagine that anyone would be scared of this place. And so that made me really compelled to write about it, and particularly this, kindergarten choice moment, because that moment is so pivotal for so many reasons. First of all, the research all shows that there's a dose response relationship for integration. So the earlier and the longer that kids are in integrated schools, the better. So it's one thing to integrate at middle school, but if we can integrate when kids are 5, it's just like so important. And so that's part of it. And also, I just think, you know, many of you who are parents in the call probably remember when your kid is 5, you're at such a critical moment of saying kind of like, who are we as a family? Like, who do we want to be? You kind of wake up to this moment of like, oh, I'm the adult and like, this is my new family and I get to choose. And what the heck am I going to choose? So for me, that was such a formative moment of just creating a family and creating a life and kind of trying to show my daughters something about who we were going to be. And, you know, I think all parents answer to their kids and, you know, who knows what my daughters will think of all of this. Many people have asked about that. But I hope that even if they hate it on some level, like in terms of the actual, that there's this book that exists and stuff like that, that they, particularly Maya, because she's the one who's mostly in the book, will appreciate that I was trying to be bold and like trying to keep that generational story moving forward. And also if she totally disagrees, I'm down to talk about it. Like that's, you know, part of who I am and part of what our relationship is all about. So far, she is totally nonplussed. Like we see it in the bookstore and she's like, oh, whatever. You know, she like could care less, which, you know, is probably understandable. She's in 2nd grade, but.
Thank you. And Marion, you're on mute. So could you unmute, please?
Excuse me. The reason I asked the question of both of you is that when someone reads this book and says, so what questions do I ask when I am looking for a school? And that was the reason I asked it that way, because you've got a choice coming up, you know, in a few years. And what questions will you ask? What will you look at? And someone who's reading your book and making that decision with a 5-year-old, it would be good to know. And I'm sure you explained it in the book that how you chose it because you saw the children in the schoolyard. And for many of us, I live in the South, I'm in North Carolina, and here we look at test scores. You know, that's one of the ways that that we have a rating system. You can look up the schools in Charlotte Mecklenburg and they got stars, okay? But it doesn't ask the questions that you've been talking about that are so important. And that's the reason I ask it, not to upset you that you got to make this decision again, but more of what is a person who sees the value in what you're saying, what do they look at and what do they ask?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up test scores because that is a big part of the book, as folks who have read it remember. And test scores really map onto socioeconomic status as opposed to actual aptitude or quality of teaching. And so most of our rating systems, including what you see at greatschools.org, are woefully inadequate to describe a school. And as you all know, being in community, how do you put a number on a community? Like it's a very complex, dynamic system. So there is other kinds of data. There's something in California called the Healthy Kids Survey, which has data about belonging. Do kids feel like teachers see them? Like there's a teacher that they could go to? Do they feel safe? And I didn't even know this at the time that I was choosing, but Emerson has great test scores on California Healthy Kids Survey. Now has great teacher retention, which is another really important indicator of like, are teachers happy there? The grown-ups who are teaching, do they feel supported? Versus our test scores, which are pretty bad because we have a lot of kids from families with, you know, low-income backgrounds who have not been like reading to their kids nonstop since they were, you know, babies like Ingrid and I probably have, and all these other factors that really affect how kids do on tests. I was especially horrified this week because US News and World Report, you guys know that thing that ranks colleges. Ingrid, have you seen this? This week, they decided to now rank elementary schools. So Emerson is ranked,
Wow.
which I don't care about Emerson. Like I knew Emerson's rank would be low because it's entirely based on test scores, nothing else. So Emerson's rank is like 44th out of 50th of the elementary schools in Oakland. And it even ranks by the whole state of California. So it's like this meaningless thing that says like 4,322, you know, it's just like the speaking of like, you know, reductive thinking, like to rank elementary schools just seems like the craziest idea to me, and just like pushing us even further in a direction that we do not need any encouragement to go as white and privileged people. It's just like very upsetting to me. So yeah, test scores are a really bad proxy. And the less we pay attention to those, the better. Sadly, most people don't know that. And their greatschools.org is actually channeled into the real estate website. So if you're on Zillow or Redfin or one of these real estate sites and you look up an address, you'll see like Emerson 2 out of 10 on greatschools.org. So it has a really profound effect. And I've been in relationship with the founder, I mean, not the founder, the executive director, for a couple of years now, really trying. I mean, I think it's a very Garrett Buxian attempt, Barb, you'll appreciate. I've been like trying to like stay in friendship with him and just like be kind, but also be like, do you realize the impact this is having? And most recently he told me he's leading a book club of learning in public, which shocked me. And I'm gonna have coffee with him on Wednesday, and I'm still trying to figure out this right balance of kindness, but also like being bold with him and saying, you know, how can we shift this impact? Because it's very profound. Most white parents see the 2 out of 10 at Emerson as just a case study and will not even look at the school.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And be bold. Leslie, you're up.
Yeah, you talked about how much better it is for kids to be in an integrated school. What about places where that's not an option? Like a lot of my family lives in places where there is nobody other than white people.
Yeah, this is a really important question, and one that actually came up on our book tour, or my book tour. And I had this fascinating experience where that was asked, and I was being interviewed by a woman named Ashley McBride, who's this awesome Black young woman reporter for the Oakland side. I don't know if anyone has seen, probably may have seen Berkeley side. Now there's an Oakland version called Oakland side. And Ashley McBride does all the educational equity reporting. And she's just like fantastic. And she interviewed me for the Commonwealth Club, if anyone has been to stuff there. And someone asked this, and I said something like, well, even in a segregated environment, like there are so many things you can do to teach your kids about both racism, but also what anti-racist whiteness looks like, and both historically and contemporarily, and like, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then Ashley was like, you need to move, which I was very shocked by. And I think it's like pretty, you know, it's not particularly pragmatic. It's like to tell someone they need to move for that. I like, it's hard for me to believe that people would move for that reason alone, but I did think it was a pretty fascinating difference in our reactions. And I've had a lot of friends who live at Bozeman, Montana, Northampton, Massachusetts, like these places, who say, I love the book and I can't really figure out what to do with it in that regard.
Yeah, I think they want you to move so you can teach them how to do it, not to leave. But yeah, so are there resources for these schools, these schools in completely white communities, that they can get information on how to do it? Or
oh yeah, there's all kinds of awesome stuff out there. There's an organization called Embrace Race, The Conscious Kid. Ingrid, does anything come to mind for you? There's like, depending on if people are like what kind of media they use, there's websites, there's workshops, there's Instagram accounts to follow, there's like all kinds of cool stuff. Ingrid,
Okay.
do you have thoughts?
I mean, I just put in integrated schools where you'll find a lot of families who are moving to get out of white America. They're making that choice. I think like for my relatives in a small town in rural Kansas, I think that would be really heartbreaking to see them like leave family, generations of family in a small town just to surround their kids with more diversity. But I also know a family that left because they couldn't handle the white supremacy in that town, and they're living now in a city and much happier. So yeah. And then, yeah, I think I put in the integrated schools website. I've been really impressed with Rethinking Schools and with the Abolitionist Teaching Network and stuff, but that's more like for things for the teachers to do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jeannie? Oh, and Leslie, anything else?
Oh, that's it.
Okay, Jeannie, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say you don't have to go as far as Montana to find a white community. All you have to do is go to Orinda or Moraga, and you'll find a very, very segregated white community. And when my daughter was in high school, she's 23 now, at El Cerrito High, we would play football against them, and she was a cheerleader. And it was horrifying to go there. Our side was almost completely black, except myself and 2 or 3 other parents. Their side was almost completely white, and their security would literally stop our kids from walking in front of their students. All the while they were letting their students sit there and smoke pot in the bleachers. It was horrifying. I mean, it woke me up about our Bay Area bubble and how great we are in the Bay Area. You know, all you have to do is go over the hills, and it's a completely different situation. Very distressing.
Yeah, and also I would argue you don't have to go over the hills. I mean, part of what this book is about is, that sounds like pretty overt racism. But I'm really in this book trying to ask us as progressive white people, where does the rubber meet the road for us? Like, where is our uncomfortable edge where we say, like, yeah, I'm going to go to the protest and I'm going to buy the books with, you know, Black kid characters, and I'm going to do all these things. But when it comes to my kid's school, you know, that's a third rail. You can't mess with that. And so I think even not in Orinda or Moraga, we have a lot of white parents who are progressive in lots of ways and make anti-racist choices. But when it comes to this school question,
Yes, right.
it's a no-go.
Yeah. You know, and it was interesting at El Cerrito High, which she had actually a very good experience at. So, you know, going to the football games, mostly African-American, but then I would go to the PTA meetings and it was mostly white parents.
Yeah.
You know, it was very rare, you know, well, not rare, I mean, but it was mostly white parents. And so the kids didn't necessarily mix, you know, segregate by race or anything. But parent activities certainly did. So that was interesting.
Yeah, we've totally struggled with that at Emerson. And I think both Ingrid and I have made a big effort to make sure that I do this thing called the School Site Council, and Ingrid has done this, you know, PTA, which most people know about. And, you know, I really watched Ingrid make a huge effort to like recruit parents of color to those meetings, to make sure they were translated into different languages, to like make sure they felt welcoming, and really, you know, followed her lead in a lot of ways. I'm a little less go get them on the playground, but I do my best to be extroverted in those moments. And I'm so excited, Ingrid. I haven't even been able to talk to you about this, but we just had the new board of the School Site Council elected, and we have a Black mom with a kid with special needs as the chair, which is really exciting, who is an educator herself and teaches at Emerson and has a background as a preschool teacher. Vice chair is this white guy, stay-at-home dad, who used to be a baker but is now a stay-at-home dad, and he actually broke bread at our first meeting. It was so sweet. He brought bread and broke it and we all ate it. And another Black mom, who's a new chairpersons, and then we have 2 other Black parents, a Black mom who has a lot of educational experience and a Black dad with 3 kids who are actually doing the Sojourner Truth, the distance learning thing right now. So it's just like, that was so thrilling to me, because both Ingrid and I have worked so hard to diversify the parent leadership at our schools, because when we came in, I don't remember what the PTA was exactly like, but the SSC was like 4 white parents sitting in a room, and I was like, what is going on here? This does not look at all like the school itself.
Just one more comment that the other thing that El Cerrito High was really good about was the integration by class. And Gabriella had been to private schools up to then. And it was so good for her to be around kids whose parents, you know, didn't make as much money as we did and stuff. And I thought the school did very well at managing those differences across schools, you know, where kids, you know, no matter their, you know, how much money they had, participated in activities and stuff. And they did a good job supporting people, I thought.
That's great.
Thank you, Jeannie. We have time for maybe one or two more, but I just wanted to mention, can you guys hear me? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that Courtney sent several ways where we can work, and I put it in the chat, but I just realized that the links are not working. So hang on.
I can put them in, Barb.
Okay, thanks. And I also wanted to just quickly share my screen because that also has the links. And
Oh, great.
so, yeah. So this, thanks for sending that. Do you want to mention what these are? Obviously, Emerson's the school, but the equity out.
Sure. Yeah. I didn't know if folks on the call were interested in you know, giving money or getting involved in some way. But Emerson is our elementary school. October is our month of giving, where it's like our big fundraising drive. So if anyone is inspired to give money to Emerson, I'll throw the link in chat. Equity Allies for OUSD is this really cool organization in Oakland that works on all things structural equity. Like they're working on, could there be a new enrollment system in Oakland? We have a really bad enrollment system compared to Berkeley's that's just very vulnerable to kind of white strategizing and privileged parents like figuring out how to game the system. And then the Friends, and they also, Equity Allies also has a fund where they take donations and then distribute them to the least resourced schools in Oakland. And they have a really wise calculation about how they figure that out. So they are really awesome. There are some schools that don't even have a PTA. So Emerson is like heads and shoulders above a lot of other kinds of schools. And actually Emerson gives a percentage of our PTA funds to this fund to be redistributed because we know that that's the case. And then Friends of the Forest is Mrs. Miner's preschool. She and I created this opportunity together for privileged white families, anyone who's interested, to donate. And what it specifically goes to is Black families in Oakland. Most of these folks like work at Amazon warehouses or do other kinds of like, you know, pretty profoundly underpaid work. And it helps those families. They qualify for subsidies, but they still have a copay when they go to school. And she's noticed that when her families show up, they're like pulling cash, you know, dollar bills out of their socks. They're like really struggling to make that copay. So me and Mrs. Miner came up with this dream that what if all the families who qualify just get to come for free, and she gets to say to them, like, put your cash back in your socks, like you know, your money's no good here, basically. So she and I together have been trying to raise money for that purpose. So if that inspires you, I'll put the link in as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the most important thing is to buy the book, right?
That's very sweet. Yeah, it's definitely not the most important thing. You can get it from the library, you can borrow it from a friend, but my publisher would like you to buy the book.
That's right. Right. And Tom, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I downloaded the ebook on my iPad. So.
Oh, great.
And I'm not finished it either. I've gotten about over half of it, and it is very fast, very easy reading, very short chapters actually. So I expect to finish it soon. But I had a couple observations. Actually, one of them looking at this group tonight, I'm seeing it's predominantly women. There's been only about 3, maybe 4 of us. Oh, well, we've been started by Chris Valentine. So we're back to 3 or 4. I don't know if Fred Guy is actually on the call, or is it just Sandra? But it's just an interesting observation that this is a topic that is predominantly of interest to women after all these years where we were supposed to have men more interested in their children's education. The other observation I have is my granddaughter just completed her elementary at Lincoln Elementary in Chinatown. And that was a very positive experience. And of course, being in Chinatown, it is predominantly Asian, but there were a fair number of Black students as well, and very activist Black parents as well. So I thought it was very a positive experience, even though I wasn't as involved as obviously her parents were, but I would go and I would regularly pick her up from after school care there and bring her back home. But now she started in a charter school in the city of Alameda. So I'd be interested to see how that is in contrast. They could not find any good schools near them. The one middle school over, they live in Adams Point, and the one over by Grand Lake was closed by the district. So it was a very challenging thing for them to find a good middle school for her. But those are my observations.
Really interesting. Yeah, I've heard great things about Lincoln, so I'm glad she got to experience that community. That's awesome. And yeah, tends to still be sadly quite a gendered experience. And I really tried to lean into that in the sense that I think white women, in some ways have gotten a pass. We think of like white guys as being the ones who chipped away at Brown v. Board, like, white racist judges who, were in the KKK in their off time and kept chipping away at Brown v. Board over the years. But historians have really documented beautifully that white mothers played a huge role in eroding Brown v. Board. And we did it versus the soft, power of PTA meetings, auxiliary meetings, birthday parties, like just, drumming this constant beat that integration was dangerous for our kids. And there's an amazing historian, Elizabeth McRae Gillespie, who talks about this as white women being the constant gardeners of segregation, white mothers. And so I think a lot about how to be a constant gardener of the opposite. Like, what does it look like to be at a birthday party? And when these issues come up, say the uncomfortable thing that's going to kind of be like the record scratching. What does it look like to, constantly, like I just did about Lincoln, say, oh, I've heard great things about that school. I have heard great things about that school. A lot of people would say, well, it's like a high minority population, so they would just assume it's a bad school because they look at the playground and they don't see a lot of white kids. So just constantly trying to garden a different kind of mentality, which I know is part of what Ingrid's trying to do in her life as well. There are really important male father leaders at Emerson, for sure. And actually, I would say one interesting experience we have so many Black dads and Black grandfathers, and there's a real sense that fathers of color are very involved in their kids' lives at Emerson, whereas I see less white dads actually. And Black dads get such a bad rap in our sort of mainstream media, and that's not what I'm seeing every day. I'm seeing some very involved Black and brown dads.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up. Courtney, one quick question. What's next? Are you on to another book?
Oh, not at all. No, not at all. I've actually, I've been reading a lot about a civil rights leader named Septima Clark. Does anyone know about her? Yeah, I'm seeing some good nods. A friend of mine told me about her a long time ago, and I really wanted to dig into this biography. And so I've been really slowly reading and just reveling in this biography about Septima Clark, who's a civil rights figure that most people don't know, who created these things called citizenship schools. And she largely created them using beauticians. So she figured out that like women who ran beauty salons were great at talking to people and relating to everybody. And the idea of the citizenship schools was you start by teaching people to read and write, and then you keep moving up the ladder to teach them about the Constitution and teach them about voting, and then you register all these people to vote. So many people argue that like she's the reason MLK was so successful. Like she sowed all these seeds for people to end up showing up, and she was a teacher. So I'm obviously obsessed with teachers at this point, and so it feels like a pretty normal thing to be thinking about now, or a pretty organic thing to be thinking about now. I don't know what I'll do with the research I'm doing, but that's who I've been hanging out with in my mind a lot lately.
Well, thank you. And, you know, any last words of wisdom, or shall we sign off so everybody can get back to their lives? Yeah.
I guess maybe I shouldn't say this, but maybe I will anyway, because as Courtney knows, I just do. So I don't know. I'm seeing that there's like 20 people on here, and I know for a fact that for some of you, $10 is a lot to ask. But for those for whom $10 is not a lot to ask, I'm just wondering how many people might be willing to chip in, because our PTA president right now is a Black man, and he dropped his phone in some water, and he doesn't have enough money to buy a new phone. I've been helping him out. He could use a new phone.
How do we contribute?
It's hard because we're all Zoom based, but I don't know, you can donate to Emerson, and we're going to work on allowing our PTA board members, which includes committee chairs and stuff, to apply for grants for technology, because we're finding that our lower income parents, they don't have what they need to be able to do leadership stuff. Or if you want to just Venmo me $10, if that's easier than doing PayPal, you could do that.
Or you guys can email me and I'll make sure it gets to you, Ingrid.
That sounds even easier. Yeah. Okay.
And
okay.
Thanks for the plug. You know, I mean, I think that it's obvious that there's a real need. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and we're going to wrap up in just a moment. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there and staying the whole time. Ingrid, I know you're recovering, so bravo for making it through the whole.
Yeah, feel better, Ingrid.
Feel better.
Ingrid, could you put your Venmo address in the chat?
That's a good idea.
And this was great. Thank you so much to Courtney and to Ingrid and to Barb for organizing this.
I said my happy place is asking questions, not answering them. I want you to know that I look around this group and I know I could interview each of you for probably an hour and a half and learn so many amazing things about who you are and what you've done to move this ball forward.
A very different experience in my case from what you've heard tonight. I had 4 children in the 70s who were compulsory busing. It wasn't the same story that you've been hearing tonight at all.
Well, let's unmute and give Ingrid and Courtney a big hand. Thank you ever so much, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much, Barb. Really appreciate you organizing.
Thank you for being here. I'll stay on for a minute more.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, Mommy.
Yeah, am I muted or not?
No, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, Barb asked, you know, basically how Anders was doing, how he had reacted, and I think you went into a little bit about the head trips you went through, putting him in the school, and less about him. But I think one thing with both him and with Maya, Courtney's daughter, you know, obvious from the book, is that neither one of them went into shock to be in an integrated school. And part of that was the fact that their parents role modeled getting involved in the school and getting to know other parents of whatever color and saying good morning to them and knowing their names and that kind of thing, which I think, you know, these white parents that might be intimidated about going to an integrated school are just worried about what are the grades, you know, like what are the reading scores and that kind of thing. I think what they don't realize is, and that we found, because I volunteered 2 days a week at Emerson when Anders was in kindergarten and first, that the teachers are so loving and so committed, and the kids are great. They're just kids. They're like kids anywhere. But if the parent, and this is probably particularly true, you know, for a white parent, if you just want to make sure how your kid is fitting in there and feeling in their comfort zone and that kind of thing. If the parent gets even a little bit involved, it helps so much. And there were parents, both black and white, that came into the media center and volunteered on days that they have parents come in for reading. So it doesn't have to be somebody necessarily that has the time to take a leadership role in PTA or whatever, but there were some parents that came in and helped with crafts at Halloween or whatever it was. Anytime the parent of any color gets involved, it helps that kid in school. And so I wanted to say, I think Anders and Maya both probably have felt quite comfortable in the school and done well. And, maybe they would have done well at any school they'd gone to, whether it was predominantly white or whatever. But even in those schools, you have all these little things that children have to navigate about who's popular and who isn't, and whether some kids are a bully and that kind of thing. So, I mean, there's just a lot to do to help make sure your kid is secure. And Ingrid had one really proud moment as a parent, because there was a little boy that said to her, I think it was in first grade, "Are you Anders' mom?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Every time I see Anders, he's helping somebody." So that was so sweet. So I think that shows that, he was happy being there.
And Anders still doesn't believe that that's possible, that kid said it, because this was this kid that comes from a very, very troubled home and who acts out in class and stuff. And Anders was like, "Are you sure it was him?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm sure it was him."
Yeah, and Andres made good friends with some of the kids that are, from immigrant families, and he's just his own little person, and I think he'll grow up less intimidated being around people of any race or religion, because, like Courtney said, or maybe one of the others of the people on here said, when they get started early with that exposure, it's more impactful even than when it just starts in middle school or high school all of a sudden.
Beautiful. Thank you, Linda.
Yep. And thank you for doing the whole interview tonight, everybody, and attending.
Yeah, really.
This is good.
If I could just share one more thing before we go. Actually, I moved up from a very segregated community in San Diego to Berkeley, so my daughter could live, attend an integrated school and not live in an integrated neighborhood. And as I lived here in West Berkeley, my block, it's just 100% white now. So I tried to move to an integrated neighborhood, and now segregated. It's ironic also, we've had a number of shootings in this neighborhood in the last few months. And actually tonight I got home, got on my Twitter and discovered that there was another shooting down on a block from me on 8th and Channing, just as I was getting home. So I didn't hear the shooting, but it sounds like we've got another shooting in our neighborhood too. So I don't know what's going on, but a lot of change is happening, I guess.
Yeah. So much for crime being a Black neighborhood thing, huh?
That's right. That's right. It just happens in the city.
Well, Tom, you were almost my next door neighbor for a while there when I lived over there. I'm so sorry to hear that there's a bunch of shootings going on. I'll pray for y'all.
Yeah. Thanks.
Remember, Catherine Anderson used to say the same thing, I think, about the changes in her neighborhood, that when she first moved in there, it was much more diverse, and I guess gentrification hitting us everywhere.
Berkeley is a pretty segregated city, actually. Well, this was interesting to me because I think Helen left, but my dad was in the Navy, but when we still lived in the States when I was a kid, I lived in Norfolk, which had a big, lots of violence and stuff with segregation and integrating the schools. And let's see, in 5th grade, how they started was moving the Black teachers around. And so I had a Black teacher in 5th grade, and then we moved to Puerto Rico. So I didn't experience busing. And it wasn't really an issue because the military was always, well, not always, but by that time was pretty integrated. And so I went to a Navy school and stuff. But, you know, in the South, of course, there were all kinds of segregated, I mean, problems with integration. But one of my friends in Puerto Rico was Black, and they were going to move back to Boston because she figured in the North there won't be problems, right? And of course, Boston exploded, you know, over integration with all kinds of violence and stuff. So I just think about this kind of discussion and think back, and you know, I'm older than a bunch of you, but you know, it's been in my lifetime, you know, that that this has shifted so much. And I would bet that Marion and Barb also probably have interesting stories, having, you know, also grown up in the South and stuff.
Yeah, my high school was the first one in the city of Charlotte to be integrated.
Mhm.
And the Black Panthers came on campus one day and was, you know, stirring things up. And yeah, it was pretty dramatic.
Yeah, yeah,
Anything else?
yeah. Well, this was excellent. Barb, thanks again for organizing it, and Ingrid, you know, for participating and for all the work you're doing, you know, in the schools. It's really great. And I hope it feels good that, you know, you've made a difference. You know, it clearly you're making a difference there. I hope.
Well, and like Tori said, like, let's not overemphasize how much good us white folks are doing in the school.
Well, you're doing something. Yeah.
I'm being human, and you guys inspire me, and I'm so grateful for meeting. I mean, meeting is in the book. Y'all are in the book, so you should be proud of that.
That's
Ah.
We are in the book.
Oh, okay. I haven't gotten that far. Great. I'm good though. Okay, take care.
All right, you guys inspire me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Good night, all.
Good night, everybody.
Nighty night.
Hi. I just unmuted myself.